to message, CEO.
Trudeau, to the current leadership.
We are an energy powerhouse. We have.
So they actually make up.
Yes, the U.S. is our #1 customer. This just does not make sense. I have a recommendation for President Trump. Start focusing on China.
26. President Donald Trump signed a set of executive actions that would place a 50% tariff on a wide range of Canadian goods, with the measures scheduled to take effect in about 30 days. Within hours, Ontario Premier Doug Ford responded with some of the sharpest language of the entire dispute, describing the American president as a bully and arguing that Canada should answer, in his words, tariff for tariff and dollar for dollar. Other premiers weighed in as well, and one idea in particular has echoed across the country: the claim that Canada, as a major energy supplier, could apply enormous pressure of its own.
Potentially could be going up.
We're looking probably at like in the negatives. Just to make sure that we don't have brand damage from people.
The central question now is whether the country will move as one. Let me take you carefully through what actually happened, because the details matter. According to the White House, the president issued 3 separate proclamations, each targeting a category of trade that Washington says has treated American producers unfairly. The stated complaints center on automobiles, on dairy products including cheese, and on alcohol.
This is something that I've been expecting for a while. I'm surprised it took them this long to come with some retaliatory tariffs, and this is the reason that we need to do what we're doing and work on becoming more self.
The administration has framed the new tariffs as a response to what it calls unequal treatment of American cars, farm goods, and beverages inside the Canadian market. The tariffs are set at 50%, a level far higher than the earlier rounds of duties that have defined this dispute, and that jump is a large part of why the reaction has been so immediate. What stands out to me first is the scope of the products involved. Based on the lists released alongside the proclamations, the affected goods include everyday consumer items and industrial materials alike. Canadian wine is on the list. So are hockey sticks and other pieces of hockey equipment, along with items such as cement, plywood, and other wood products, paper goods, clothing, video game consoles, golf equipment, ice skates, and even household staples like toilet paper. These are not obscure exports. They are products that move across the border in large volumes every day, which means the practical footprint of this measure is wide. There is an important exception worth emphasizing.
We stand, divided we fall. Who's not carrying their weight? It just seems like Ontario is always out there, no matter if it's electricity or if it's alcohol or anything.
Several major Canadian exports appear to have been spared, at least for now. Reporting on the proclamations indicates that energy, potash, critical minerals, and fish are not covered by the new 50% rate. That detail is significant because energy and potash are precisely the sectors that some premiers have pointed to as sources of Canadian leverage.
Not weakness. And we need to throw everything on the table. But I want to emphasize one more time, it can't always be Ontario.
In other words, the two sides are circling the same pressure points, and each appears aware of where the other is most exposed. The timing is especially important here. Prime Minister Mark Carney responded by saying that Canada believes in the benefits of free and fair trade, and he indicated that the country stands ready to intensify trade talks with the United States in the coming weeks. Carney also stated that the new tariffs violate the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, the trade pact often referred to by its initials, and he raised the issue of threats to Canadian sovereignty, a phrase widely understood as a reference to the president's repeated comments about Canada becoming an American state.
And start focusing on Russia. Not your closest friend that fought wars shoulder to shoulder with our great American allies.
We so appreciate your time today. I know.
So on one hand, the federal government is signaling a willingness to negotiate. On the other hand, it is making clear that it views these measures as a breach of an existing agreement. Both messages arrived on the same day. That brings us to the reaction that has drawn the most attention. Ontario Premier Doug Ford did not soften his words. He posted on social media that if the tariffs proceed, Canada should respond tariff for tariff and dollar for dollar, and he said plainly that he will never stop fighting to protect his province. In further remarks, Ford repeatedly described the president as a bully, using the image of a schoolyard where standing up is the only way to stop someone from taking your lunch money. He argued that Canada has spent too much time on the defensive and needs to move on to the offensive. He called for what he described as a full Team Canada approach, insisting that Ontario cannot carry this fight alone and that the federal government needs a clear plan for what happens if the talks fail. It is worth slowing down on one particular line, because it is the phrase that gave this story its headline. Ford argued that Canada is an energy powerhouse, and he said that the country could, in his words, dismantle the United States economically if the provinces worked together. He pointed to electricity, to potash, and to oil, noting that Canada is a leading customer and supplier for the American market, and he said the goal should be to make the other side feel the pressure rather than absorbing it repeatedly. I want to be precise about what this is and what it is not. This is a political statement about leverage, not a policy that has been enacted. No province has announced that it will cut off electricity or halt shipments of oil or potash. Ford was describing what he believes Canada is capable of and framing it as a case for unity, not announcing a concrete action. Ford was also direct about one specific measure already in place: the removal of American alcohol from provincial shelves. He made clear that Ontario will not restock United States liquor products while American tariffs remain on Canadian goods, and he explicitly tied the booze ban to the broader tariff fight, including duties on steel and aluminum. In his framing, that ban stays in place until Washington moves. He also cited a figure of roughly $28 billion in exposure across the country, with the largest share, in his estimation, falling on Ontario because of its heavy manufacturing base. I would add a note of care here. The White House has described the new tariffs as covering roughly $20 billion in Canadian goods, so the numbers being discussed depend on how the impact is measured and by whom. The precise economic scale is still being assessed. To understand why this escalated now, we need to look at what happened earlier, because this is not a dispute that began this week. Tensions between the two neighbors have been building since the president returned to office in January 2025 and launched a broad program of tariffs affecting many trading partners. In the case of Canada, one of the early flashpoints involved automobiles. In April 2025, Canada imposed retaliatory measures on American vehicles and auto parts after the United States applied its own duties on cars and key components. Around the same period, in February 2025, Ontario and most other provinces began pulling American alcohol from government-run stores in response to the initial American tariffs. Nearly every province took part, with Alberta and Saskatchewan standing as exceptions. So the booze bans that Washington now cites as a grievance were themselves a reaction to earlier American tariffs. Each side points to the other as the party that started the current cycle. There is another layer to the alcohol dispute that helps explain its intensity. Ontario's removal of American products was reinforced later when Ford signaled he was prepared to expand the ban further after a major beverage company announced it would close a bottling facility in the province. The alcohol issue has become a symbol in this fight, larger than its dollar value alone, because it is visible to ordinary shoppers and because provincial liquor agencies are among the biggest buyers of these products in the world. When a crown retailer of that size stops purchasing, suppliers notice. That is part of why alcohol has ended up at the center of proclamations coming out of Washington. The political response on the Canadian side has not come only from Ontario, and this is where the story becomes a genuine national conversation. In British Columbia, the Premier said his province would not return American alcohol to store shelves, and he insisted that Canada's integrity in this dispute remains intact. He went further, saying he had asked staff to have a friendly message his government had contributed to an American anniversary website removed, a symbolic gesture reflecting how much the mood has shifted. In Quebec, the province's leadership emphasized that it would defend Quebec's economy, its workers, and its businesses, and stated that supply management, the system that governs sectors such as dairy, is non-negotiable. That position matters, because dairy is one of the specific areas the American proclamations single out.
People, I believe in making a free and fair trade agreement, no different than what Ronald Reagan believed in. And every tariff he puts on...
Quebec officials also described the American threats as unjustified and concerning. Other voices in the country pushed a different but related theme: self-reliance. Some provincial leaders argued that this moment confirms the need for Canada to become more self-sufficient, to strengthen its own supply chains, and to diversify its trade relationships so that it depends less on a single partner. The argument there is that repeated tariff threats have become a pattern rather than an isolated event, and that Canada should plan accordingly. Alongside that, senior figures echoed a phrase that has become something of a rallying line in these negotiations: the idea that no deal is better than a bad deal. The message from that camp is that Canada should not accept unfavorable terms out of anxiety about what might come next. I want to examine now where these positions actually differ, because the premiers are not entirely aligned, and that gap is the real test ahead. Ford is pressing for an aggressive, immediate, and coordinated retaliation if the talks collapse, and he is publicly urging the Prime Minister to produce a concrete plan. Others favor a more measured approach, arguing that retaliation should be carefully targeted rather than sweeping, to avoid raising prices on Canadians themselves. This is the tension at the heart of the Team Canada idea. Everyone agrees on unity in principle. The harder question is what unity looks like in practice, how far to go, how quickly, and which tools to use. Getting all of the country's premiers to agree on a single response will require negotiation among themselves, not only with Washington. The setting for that internal negotiation is already in place. The premiers have been meeting through the Council of the Federation, the body that brings the provincial and territorial leaders together, and those meetings were scheduled to continue through the middle of the week. That means the reaction we are seeing is not just a series of separate statements.
They're very handsome-looking planners. And how important is the U.S. market for your company?
So we've always been very focused on Canada, but we've left it open to...
It is unfolding inside a coordinated gathering where leaders are actively discussing how to respond. Prime Minister Carney, for his part, has indicated that decisions about whether to restock American alcohol rest with the provinces, which keeps some of the most visible pressure at the provincial level, even as Ottawa leads the trade talks. From the American side, the messaging has been firm. The United States Trade Representative suggested in public comments that Canada has been willing to talk and to meet, but, in his characterization, not willing to actually change the underlying policies that Washington objects to. He accused Canada of moving slowly on American concerns. Canadian officials describe the situation very differently, arguing that the American demands keep shifting and that the proclamations list grievances that were already well known, which they say signals a breakdown in negotiations rather than a good faith impasse. I present both readings because the gap between them is precisely what negotiators will have to close, and because each side is publicly blaming the other for the lack of progress. There is also a broader economic issue running underneath the political language. Business leaders and analysts have warned that tariffs of this size inject significant uncertainty into cross-border commerce, and uncertainty itself has a cost. When companies do not know what the rules will be in a month, investment tends to stall. That concern was echoed in the Canadian reaction, with the argument that a stable agreement would give businesses on both sides the confidence to invest, produce, and hire, while a prolonged standoff risks the opposite outcome, including job losses on both sides of the border. It is important to keep this framed as a risk rather than a certainty. These are potential consequences that depend heavily on how long the tariffs last and how each government responds. Let me turn now to the people most likely to feel this directly, because policy at this scale eventually reaches ordinary households. For consumers, the products on the list, from wine to hockey equipment to clothing, could become more expensive if the tariffs take effect and if costs are passed along. For workers, the concern is concentrated in sectors that trade heavily across the border. Manufacturing regions in Ontario are exposed because so much of the country's industrial output flows south. In Quebec, the wood and forestry sector has already been under strain from the wider trade dispute, and additional duties on wood and paper products add to that pressure. Wine producers and other Canadian food and beverage makers could see both challenges and opportunities, with some industry voices encouraging consumers to buy domestic products in response. For border communities, provincial governments, and businesses that operate on both sides, the practical stakes are immediate. Supply chains that were built around open trade do not adjust overnight. A cement supplier, a furniture maker, or a small manufacturer that relies on components crossing the border may face difficult decisions about pricing, sourcing, and staffing well before any long-term resolution is reached.
To America, because there's a lot of people down there that love planners and notebooks, and actually a lot of people that like to support Canadian-made and sustainable. So they actually make up half.
This is why the 30-day window matters so much. It is short enough to create urgency, but long enough that negotiations could still change the outcome before the tariffs are actually collected. That leads to the questions I suspect many of you are asking. Will these tariffs definitely take effect? At this point, that is not guaranteed. They have been announced with an effective date roughly a month out, and both governments have signaled openness to more talks in that window, so the situation could shift. Will Canada retaliate, and if so, how? That remains unresolved. Ford and some other premiers are calling for a strong, matching response, but the federal government has not laid out the specific measures it would use, and premiers differ on how aggressive to be. Could Canada really use energy as leverage? That idea has been raised loudly in political terms, but no concrete action to restrict energy exports has been announced, and doing so would carry serious consequences for Canada as well. What I find most notable in all of this is how the dispute keeps circling back to a small number of pressure points. Washington is targeting autos, dairy, and alcohol. Canadian leaders are pointing to energy, potash, and electricity. The booze bans that began as a response to earlier tariffs have now become one of the stated reasons for new tariffs, which shows how each action feeds the next. This is a cycle of measure and countermeasure, and breaking that cycle is exactly what the coming round of talks is meant to attempt.
That's unacceptable. We have to work together and make sure both countries prosper and thrive.
And to give our viewers a little more sense of how you responded when this initially came.
The fact that certain critical exports were left off the list suggests that both sides may still be leaving room to maneuver. So where does that leave us as the clock starts on this 30-day period? A few things are clear. The United States has announced 50% tariffs on a broad list of Canadian goods tied to complaints over cars, dairy, and alcohol, with an effective date about a month away. Prime Minister Carney has called the measures a violation of the existing trade agreement while signaling that Canada is ready to intensify negotiations. Premiers, led vocally by Doug Ford, are demanding a unified national response and debating how forceful that response should be, even as they hold their own meetings to hash out a common position. And several important exports have been spared, which may prove to be one of the more meaningful details as talks proceed. Several things remain genuinely unresolved. It is not yet clear whether the tariffs will survive the negotiation window intact, whether they will be reduced or expanded, or exactly how Canada will retaliate if the talks fail. It is also not clear how the internal disagreements among the premiers will be settled, or whether the country will land on a single, coordinated strategy. Those are the threads to watch in the days ahead. The next official statements, especially anything that emerges from the Premier's meetings and from the trade discussions Carney has promised to intensify, should give us a much clearer sense of direction. Until then, the strongest language of the week, including the striking claim that Canada could apply overwhelming economic pressure of its own, is best understood as a signal of intent rather than a description of what has already been decided. Thank you for watching my report on President Trump's 50% tariff threat against Canada and the response from Doug Ford and Canada's premiers. This is a fast-moving story, and the next round of trade talks, along with the decisions coming out of the premiers' meetings, could change the picture significantly within the coming weeks. If you want to follow the verified updates as this dispute develops, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so that you do not miss the next major development in this Canada-United States trade standoff as it continues to unfold.